Good evening. Thank you all for coming and also for indulging us a few extra moments as we allowed people to find this place, those of us who had only been over on the SMU side of the world. I have to criticize you all because you're acting like undergraduates and avoiding the front rows. So next time, please remember. Welcome, as I was saying, and thank you for coming to this evening's event. My name is Jeffrey Engel, and I have the honor of directing the Center for Presidential History at SMU. This lecture series represents a real partnership between ourselves and the Bush Library. And tonight, in fact, marks the first occasion in the series when we've had opportunity to use this facility and to hold the event at the library proper. But let me begin by offering a confession, which is that I was not anticipating being the one standing up before you this evening. As perhaps you've heard, there are strange things afoot in the nation's capital. And among the casualties of the current government shutdown, of course, is the National Archive System, which means the Bush Library is closed for business, which means the museum is closed, the presidential archives are closed, and our good friends are furloughed. Now, it's no easy thing to be a pawn in a national game of chess or in a national game of who's going to blink first. So if you do see one of these private citizens, and tonight there are only private citizens in the audience, please do take a moment to offer your support, for we all hope that they will be back at work with all due speed. Thus, on behalf of those private citizens, let me welcome you and thank our friends and supporters and my own staff who, of course, due to the shutdown, did the yeoman's work for this evening. Now, a quick word of housekeeping. I suspect most of you parked in the Bush Library parking lot just to the, what direction is that? North of the complex here. The gate should be open when you leave. If it's not, press the big red button and something good will happen. So, speaking of quandaries in Washington, I had only hoped that for such an event that we would have somebody who might in some way tell us about the broad sweeping political and intellectual movements that led to one of the great struggles in American political life today. But in fact, who am I kidding? That's exactly who we have. This is a really tremendous foresight, and I really want to thank Ted Cruz for shutting down the government in order to help our speaks. For I think you'll all agree with me that the political movement best described as American conservatism plays no small role in American politics today. And tonight we have the man who is unquestionably the nation's leading expert in the history of that movement. Dr. George Nash's monumental work, The Conservative Intellectual Movement in America since 1945, now in its third edition, remains the singular work on the topic. But the history of conservatism is but the start of what Dr. Nash has contributed to the wider historical profession. He has worked on topics ranging from the American Revolution to the current day, most particularly focusing on the life and times of the nation's 31st president, Herbert Hoover. Now, arguably no president of the 20th century came to office better prepared with a better resume than Hoover, and arguably none left with a more troubled legacy and reputation, a legacy that Hoover strove over the remaining 3+ decades of his life to both justify and to rehabilitate. But Hoover cared not only for his own past, but also for the nation's future, and it is to this ex-president's post-White House life and vision for the future of America that we turn our attention tonight, and that is what Dr. Nash will be explaining to us this evening. We are truly privileged to hear from such an eminent scholar, and I hope you join me in welcoming Dr. George Nash.
Thank you very much, Professor Engel, and good evening, everyone. It is a pleasure and indeed an honor to be with you tonight at SMU under the auspices of the Center for Presidential History and here at the George W. Bush Institute Auditorium. And I want to thank you, Professor Engel, and all of your colleagues, including some who cannot be here tonight, who have done much to facilitate my being here, and I very much appreciate the courtesies that have been extended to me. We are gathered tonight to discuss a remarkable book by a remarkable man. This hefty volume, it weighs about 4 pounds. Freedom Betrayed, written by Herbert Hoover. It's the culmination of an extraordinary literary project launched by Hoover during World War II. a memoir that evolved into a comprehensive critique of American foreign policy during that war and during the ensuing early years of the Cold War. Although Hoover completed his manuscript almost 50 years ago, it was never published or made available for research until 2011. It was made public 2 years ago for the first time. With a touch of humor, Hoover and his staff came to refer to this enormous manuscript as the Magnum Opus. He wanted it to be an irrefutable indictment of what he called the lost statesmanship of his presidential successor, Franklin Roosevelt. To Hoover, Roosevelt's pre-war and World War II diplomacy had made the world safe for Joseph Stalin, triggering a dangerous Third World War, the Cold War as we know it, against what Hoover called a communist giant which our own leaders helped build. It is not uncommon for famous men to write their memoirs. But in this realm of exertion, as in so many others, Herbert Hoover proved to be no ordinary man. Of all the individuals who have served as presidents of the United States, none has ever written a set of memoirs as prodigious as his. To understand the history and significance of Hoover's magnum opus, we need to know something of its prehistory, the context out of which the text eventually emerged. Herbert Hoover was born in 1874 and served as President of the United States from 1929 to 1933. When he left the White House in 1933 after being defeated for re-election by Franklin Roosevelt, he did not, like most ex-presidents before him, fade away. After a period of self-imposed quiescence at his home in California, he burst back into the political arena in 1934 with a best-selling book entitled The Challenge to Liberty. It was a forceful philosophical critique of the ascendant statist ideologies of the 1930s, Nazism, communism, fascism, socialism, and what he called regimentation, his term for Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. For the rest of his life, Hoover resisted without stint the lurch to the left initiated by his successor. Hoover soon became Roosevelt's most formidable critic from the political right. Although he himself would never publicly admit it, he hankered for a rematch against Roosevelt at the polls. Denied this opportunity in 1936 when Alf Landon was the Republican nominee, the former President Hoover persisted in firing verbal fusillades at New Deal liberalism and its perpetrators. Early in 1938, the ex-president's crusade against the New Deal began to shift focus. In Europe, Germany, Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler, and fascist Italy under Benito Mussolini were ominously restless. From afar, Europe had begun to look like a pressure cooker whose cover might fly off at any time. Hoover had never been a conventional isolationist. Hailed as the great humanitarian for his stupendous relief work during and after World War I, labors that saved literally tens of millions of people in Europe and the Near East from privation and death. In 1920, he had favored America's ratifying the Treaty of Versailles and joining the League of Nations. But Hoover had spent too much time in Europe before and after the Great War, and during it as well, to believe that the United States could redeem the old world from what he saw as its age-old rivalries and hatreds. As war clouds began to form over Europe in 1938, he deliberately pulled back from that seething cauldron. Hoover was not, in the most literal sense, an isolationist. What he was, and would resolutely remain until December 7th, 1941, was an anti-interventionist, his preferred term. We Americans, he contended, should go to war solely to defeat aggression against us in our self-proclaimed zone of safety, the Western Hemisphere. Otherwise, he argued, we must refrain from military embroilment in foreign disputes. Early in 1938, Hoover sailed to Europe for his first visit there since 1919. For the next several weeks, he was showered with honors for his unparalleled humanitarian achievements during and after the Great War. By the time he returned home in late March, he had conversed with the governing elites of more than a dozen nations and had met Adolf Hitler and Neville Chamberlain. Hoover's nearly 7-week European sojourn loomed large in his eventual Magnum Opus, in which he described the experience and his impressions of the leaders he met in copious detail. Particularly revealing for insight into his geopolitical vision was his interview with Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain of Great Britain. This is March of 1938. According to Hoover, he told the British leader bluntly that another world war would probably destroy the British Empire, and that war must be avoided if at all possible. To accomplish this objective, he advised, the expansionist urges of Germany must be accommodated to some extent. Hoover did not believe that Germany intended to attack in the West. Just back from his conversations with Hitler and other European leaders, Hoover opined that Germany was now looking eastward toward the Ukraine, and that its pressure in that direction should not concern the British. According to Hoover, Neville Chamberlain concurred. Hoover also told Chamberlain that an explosion involving Nazi Germany was bound to happen somewhere. He had a hunch, he said, that another Armageddon is coming. And my hope is that if it comes, it will be on the plains of Russia, not on the frontiers of France. Western civilization, he added, will be infinitely better off if the Germans fight in the East instead of the West. It would be a disaster if the Western democracies were dragged down by a war, the end result of which would be to save the cruel Russian despotism. Those are all Hoover's words. According to Hoover, Chamberlain agreed with him. Upon his return home, Hoover admonished his fellow Americans to stay away from what he termed the maze of forces now ensnaring the old world. Although Hoover was cognizant of what he called the dangers to free men inherent in the new racialism stirring in Europe, he insisted that America itself had nothing militarily to fear. What did disturb him was the intellectual and economic turn toward collectivism in Europe, and signs that this new philosophy of government and life had begun to penetrate the United States. In the autumn of 1938, Hoover, like most Americans, including briefly President Roosevelt, appeared relieved by the peaceful outcome of the Munich Conference, at which the British and French governments agreed to Hitler's seizure of the German-speaking Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia. Certainly it is my belief, said Hoover, that neither Germany nor the fascist states want war with the Western democracies unless these democracies interfere with their spread eastward. To Hoover, what had transpired at Munich was not just the transfer of the Sudetenland to Hitler's Reich, but, in his words, the removal of impediments to the eastward movement of Nazi Germany. The former president was therefore taken aback when, just a few months later, the government of Neville Chamberlain abruptly reversed itself and pledged in March of '39 to go to war against Germany if Germany attacked Poland. To Hoover, this Anglo-French turnabout was, in his words, utterly astonishing, a complete reversal of their previous policy to let Hitler go east if he wants to. They cannot, in any circumstance, protect Poland from invasion by Hitler, he told a friend. It is simply throwing the body of Western civilization in front of Hitler's steamroller, which is on its way to Russia. Hoover never overcame his initial feeling that by issuing its fateful guarantee to Poland, the British had committed, in his words, a gigantic blunder. They had gotten in the way, again his words, of the inevitable war between Hitler and Stalin. The perceived folly of the Polish guarantee was to be one of the linchpins, of the intellectual linchpins of his Magnum Opus. But why had Neville Chamberlain so precipitously reversed course? In the months and years ahead, Hoover became suspicious that one reason was the pressure he thought was being exerted upon Chamberlain by Franklin Roosevelt. In 1939, as Roosevelt moved more assertively onto the world stage, Hoover perceived a rising specter that America's own president, by design or imprudent acts, might take the nation into the bloody morass of a European war. He became convinced that Roosevelt and his diplomatic henchmen, notably William Bullitt, ambassador to France, were secretly encouraging Great Britain, France, and Poland to stand up to Germany and possibly promising to come to their rescue if war broke out. It was a theme Hoover later developed with supporting evidence in his Magnum Opus. Writing in Liberty magazine in the summer of 1939, Hoover charged Roosevelt by name with launching a radical departure in American foreign policy and warned, in his words, that any such change should be frankly submitted to and confirmed by the American people. In foreign policy as well as domestic, Hoover now saw a challenge to liberty arising from the unconstrained executive power of the current President of the United States, Roosevelt. On September 1st, 1939, as I'm sure you all know, Nazi Germany invaded Poland. 2 days later, Great Britain and France lived up to their Polish guarantee and went to war against Germany. From the outset, Hoover argued that America must keep out of this war. It would be a long war, he predicted, and probably, in his words, the most barbarous war that we have ever known. Although repelled by Nazism and sympathetic to the Western democracies, he insisted that America cannot solve the problems of Europe. The United States, he said, could do more for that continent and for humanity by remaining outside the fray and preserving America's vitality and strength for use in the period of peace, which must sometime come. From September 1939 to December 7th, 1941, 3 mighty efforts consumed Hoover's energies as an ex-president. First, he threw himself into keeping the United States out of the widening European conflict. Although supportive of U.S. material assistance short of war to Great Britain, he opposed President Roosevelt's increasingly interventionist conduct, which Hoover found not only unwise and dangerous, but deceitful and unconstitutional. He became convinced, as he later put it in the Magnum Opus, that Mr. Roosevelt wanted war. Second, drawing upon his reputation as the great humanitarian of World War I, Hoover launched a drive to organize assistance for the civilian victims of the war engulfing Europe. He set up agencies that raised substantial sums of money for the Poles, who had been overrun by the Germans and the Russians, and also for the Finns, against whom the Russians staged a war in the winter of 1939-40. After the German blitzkrieg overran much of Western Europe in 1940, he attempted to establish a neutral relief commission, modeled on his successful experience in Belgium in World War I, to import and distribute food to the suffering civilian populations of German-occupied Poland, Norway, the Netherlands, and Belgium. Although the plan contained what Hoover considered to be adequate safeguards against German interference, the governments of Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill stymied him. Hoover's third crusade after the war began was more personal, but just as intense. His quest for political vindication, as Professor Engel has intimated in his introduction, a quest for political vindication by securing the Republican presidential nomination in 1940. Hoover maneuvered, the evidence is quite clear on this, for a deadlocked convention that he hoped would turn to him as the manifestly superior alternative to the party's lesser lights. It was all for naught. At the convention in June, the party turned instead to a charismatic newcomer named Wendell Willkie. Hoover's failure to win the 1940 Republican presidential nomination was a great disappointment to him. With his 66th birthday only weeks away, he knew that he would never have another chance to redeem himself at the polls. As the convention dispersed, he seemed to sense that an era in his life was over. Less than 4 weeks later, he started in earnest to write his memoirs. Some months later, on June 22, 1941, Adolf Hitler hurled his legions against communist Russia. To Hoover, this stunning turn of events in Eastern Europe radically transformed the nature of the war. And he now saw an opportunity to change the course of world history. On June 29th, 1 week later, he spoke to the American people on national radio. For the rest of his life, he considered this speech the most important one he ever gave. It would become another of the underpinnings of the Magnum Opus. He exhorted his fellow citizens not to make an alliance with the Soviet Union, quote, one of the bloodiest tyrannies and terrors ever erected in history, unquote. If we join this war and win, he warned, we would ensure Stalin's grip over Russia and provide an opportunity for his brutal empire to expand. Aligning with Stalin, said Hoover, would make the whole argument of our joining the war to bring the 4 freedoms to mankind a gargantuan jest. Hoover was quite content to let the 2 evil dictators, Hitler and Stalin, fight it out on their own. Be patient, he urged Americans in mid-September. The fratricidal war, as he called it, between Hitler and Stalin was weakening both of them every day. In terms he later saw as prophetic, he solemnly warned his countrymen to take a long look now before we leap. What will happen, he asked, to the millions of enslaved people of Russia and to all Europe and to our own freedoms if we shall send our sons to win this war for communism? In November, he told Alf Landon, aid to Russia may sound practical now, but we and the world will pay dearly for this debauchery of the ideals of freedom. Meanwhile, Hoover had become alarmed by developments in the Far East. As early as the summer of 1940, he privately criticized Roosevelt's decision to curb American exports of scrap iron and aviation fuel to Japan, which was then at war with China. It was, quote, only sticking pins in a rattlesnake, he charged. Either we should leave this thing alone or we will be drawn into real trouble. In the summer and fall of 1941, after Roosevelt imposed a sweeping economic embargo against Japan, Hoover's fears intensified. By November, he was certain that war with Japan was imminent. On December 7th, the bombing of Pearl Harbor put an end to Hoover's crusade. Immediately and patriotically, he pledged his support to the nation's war against Japan. Among close friends, though, he remained convinced that Roosevelt had blundered or worse. You and I know, he said to one of them the day after Pearl Harbor, that this continuous putting pins in rattlesnakes finally got this country bitten. Despite his public and genuine support for national unity, Hoover was certain that the White House would never ask for his services during the war, as he had been asked during World War I to assist President Wilson and then after the war in humanitarian relief. He didn't think it would happen this time, and he was right. A little later in the war, Hoover signaled his availability for service via his friend Bernard Baruch. But when the financier touted Hoover's name at the White House, Roosevelt refused. "Well, I'm not a Jesus Christ," he said. "I'm not going to raise him from the dead." And so, Hoover was condemned to live and endure what he called 4 years of frustration, the remainder of World War II. Perhaps, in retrospect, it might have been better for Roosevelt if he had given his rival some constructive, nonpartisan part to play in the war effort. It might have kept Hoover occupied and away from his role as FDR's foremost antagonist. As it happened, in the 4 years after Pearl Harbor, the former president, for all his other activities, found abundant time on his hands, time to start work on his memoirs, including the chunk that became the Magnum Opus. The Crusader prophet against Roosevelt's foreign policy was about to become a Crusader historian. In a sense, the Magnum Opus was born on December 7th, 1941. Hoover was convinced that the Roosevelt administration, by its trade restrictions against Japan and what he called other provocations, had driven the Japanese government into a corner from which it had struck back after Pearl Harbor. He told friends that he intended to write a book on the diplomatic negotiations between the United States and Japan leading up to Pearl Harbor, and he was positive that he could demonstrate that the war in the Pacific could have been avoided. Hoover appears soon to have abandoned his projected book on U.S.-Japan relations before Pearl Harbor, though not his intense curiosity about the subject. Roosevelt's lost statesmanship, as Hoover termed it, toward Japan, in fact, became one of the dominant themes of the book Freedom Betrayed, the ultimate title of his memoir. But in 1942, the ex-president had other fish to fry first, notably those ongoing memoirs. In July 1940, as I mentioned earlier, Hoover began to compose his memoirs in earnest, writing them entirely by hand. By November 1944, his burgeoning manuscript comprised more than 900 printed pages and page proofs, focused on his life through the year 1932. This material would become the first 3 volumes of his memoirs. Hoover's writing now developed along 2 tracks. In the autumn of 1944, he began to compose what was in effect the 4th volume of his projected memoirs. Its subject was his crusade in the 1930s against what he called the creeping collectivism of the New Deal. That same autumn, he wrote out the first rough chapters of a parallel volume devoted to World War II and his fight to keep America out of it. He referred to this manuscript informally as the War Book. It was the embryo of what became the Magnum Opus. Hoover's War Book was to be no ordinary memoir. In an early chapter completed in December 1944, he offered a précis of his argument. In the very first paragraph, he made a remarkable vow. Not until the inner history of the events leading up to our entry into World War II are brought into the daylight can the final history of how we got into it be written. And if I live long enough, I propose to write that history. In the ensuing months, soon to be years, and then decades, Hoover was as good as his word. Early in 1946, he hired a young conservative economist named Arthur Kemp to be his part-time research assistant, a task Kemp performed for the next 7 years. Hoover already knew what he believed. What he needed and what he was sure existed was the incontrovertible evidence to sustain his revisionist case. Always he was on the lookout for fresh data and fresh corroboration of his indictment. He took careful note of the rival multi-volume magnum opus that Winston Churchill was publishing under the title The Second World War. Hoover, in brief, admired the literary excellence of Churchill's work as well as Churchill's courage, but severely criticized the substance of Churchill's book and much of Churchill's statecraft. As Hoover drafted and redrafted the Magnum Opus, his manuscript expanded into 2 volumes, the first devoted to the period before Pearl Harbor, and the second to the rest of the war and its aftermath. New topics appeared, such as communist subversion at home and America's foreign policy after the war toward China. In 1946, President Harry Truman, who became a friend of Hoover and vice versa, invited Hoover to conduct a worldwide survey of food and famine conditions on 5 continents. The former president visited 38 countries and traveled more than 50,000 miles. More than a decade later, his experiences were to shape the final portion of his Magnum Opus. Between 1947 and 1949, Hoover served as chairman of the so-called Hoover Commission, created by Congress to investigate ways to reorganize and streamline the federal government. Despite this heavy responsibility and a severe case of shingles that lasted for several months, he somehow found time for his mammoth writing project. By mid-1950, the accumulated page proofs of his entire memoirs, including the Magnum Opus, probably exceeded 3,000 printed pages. One can imagine the state of mind at times of his secretaries as they typed, retyped, and proofread his multitudinous drafts. Years later, Arthur Kemp observed, "I often think we were trying to write 8, 10, 12 volumes all at once." This is the way he worked. In 1951 and 1952, Hoover published the first 3 volumes of his memoirs, covering the period of his life through his presidency. Earlier, he had confided to a friend that the remaining parts should not be issued for some years, presumably because of their explosive character, and perhaps for fear of offending living persons. This did not, however, prevent him from pressing forward with his historical inquest. Sometime in 1950, he gave his war book a new name, Lost Statesmanship. Not long after the election of 1952, Hoover completed a fresh updating of Lost Statesmanship. As returned from the printer in early 1953, the proofs comprised 1,001 printed pages. In a climactic chapter, he listed 19 gigantic errors that American and British policymakers had committed since 1933, and these included Roosevelt's recognition of Soviet Russia in 1933, the Anglo-French guarantee of Poland in 1939, Roosevelt's undeclared war against Germany in the North Atlantic in 1941, before Pearl Harbor, the tacit American alliance with Russia after Hitler's invasion in June of 1941, and Hoover called that the greatest loss of statesmanship in all of American history. Roosevelt's total economic sanctions against Japan in the summer of 1941, his contemptuous refusal, Roosevelt's, said Hoover, of the Japanese prime minister at that point, Prince Konoe, who had peace proposals that he offered, including an attempt to have a summit conference with Roosevelt in Honolulu or Alaska. That didn't happen, and Hoover blamed Roosevelt for various reasons for seeing to it that it did not happen. Going on with Hoover's list of these gigantic errors, what he called the appeasing sacrifice of the Baltic states and other parts of Europe to Stalin at the Tehran Conference in 1943, end of November, beginning of December of that year. And then what he called Roosevelt's hideous secret agreement as to China at Yalta, which gave Mongolia and, in effect, Manchuria to Russia. President Truman's immoral order to drop the atomic bomb, his words, on Japan when the Japanese had already begun to sue for peace. And Truman's sacrifice of all China to the communists, said Hoover, after the war, by insistence of his left-wing advisors and his appointment of General Marshall to execute their will, by insisting on a coalition government between Chiang Kai-shek and his mortal enemy, Mao Zedong, and their forces. Hoover, in his analysis, which is in this book that we're discussing, put particular stress on the lost statesmanship at the Tehran conference, not so much Yalta, although he criticized that too, but particularly at Tehran, because he said it was at Tehran that Roosevelt and Churchill abandoned the transcendent ideal and promise of national self-determination proclaimed in the Atlantic Charter in 1941. And it was at Tehran, he said, that Churchill and Roosevelt faithfully acquiesced in Stalin's imperial ambitions. It was at Tehran, said Hoover, that Stalin was allowed to regain the territorial booty that he had seized after the Hitler-Stalin Pact of 1939. As you may remember, Hitler attacked Poland from the west, Stalin 17 days later from the east. They divided up Poland and divided up a lot of other territory between them. Stalin wanted to keep that after Hitler invaded in 1941, and while the war was still raging, Roosevelt and Churchill acquiesced in that basic desire at Tehran. And also, as Hoover put it, Stalin was given the green light to add a periphery of what Hoover called friendly border states as well, beyond just the territory that Stalin wanted, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, etc. In Hoover's words, the secret agreements and understanding at Tehran, in defiance of our proclaimed ideals of the war, were, in his words, the greatest blows to human freedom in the 20th century. Some years later, a friend suggested that if Hoover had published Lost Statesmanship right then and there in that form in 1953, its emotional impact would have been tremendous. The Korean War, you might recall, was still on. Instead, a perfectionist always, and perhaps concerned about premature release of his explosive indictment, Hoover farmed it out for still more editing and feedback. The cycle of research, revision, fact-checking, and more revisions resumed. Meanwhile, in 1953, President Eisenhower had come into the presidency, and he appointed Hoover chairman of a new federal commission on governmental reorganization, a body that quickly became known as the Second Hoover Commission. The aging elder statesman devoted most of the next 2 years to its work. In 1955, after completing this latest service to the nation, Hoover refocused on his private affairs, including an increasingly nagging question: what to do about the remainder of his memoirs. As it turned out, he soon became engrossed in a new writing project, a comprehensive history of what he called American enterprises of compassion, primarily his enterprises, that had saved literally millions of lives from famine and disease during and after World Wars I and II. He gave the series the title, An American Epic. Originally, he planned to write 2 volumes. They soon became 3 and then 4. By now, it was plain that Hoover, the historian, rarely proceeded in a straight line. While working on the American epic, he decided to write a spin-off volume about Woodrow Wilson's experiences at the Paris Peace Conference of 1919, when Hoover had been present also. Part memoir and part historical narrative, The Ordeal of Woodrow Wilson, as he entitled it, was published in 1958. And it proved to be one of the most admired of Hoover's publications. By the mid-1950s, Suite 31A at the Waldorf Astoria Towers in New York City, where Hoover was living most of the time, seemed more like a writing factory than a residence. Hoover's staff was amazed by his phenomenal memory and remarkable capacity for work. Now in his 80s, he arose daily at 5:30 a.m. and was at his desk by 6. Except for breakfast, a short lunch, and a mid-afternoon coffee break, he did not stop working until 6 or 7 at night. Hoover routinely went to bed at 10 p.m., but not for long. Often in his last years, he arose around 2 in the morning, warmed up a can of soup, perhaps, in the kitchen, and spent the next hour or more at his desk writing letters and laboring over his manuscripts. whereupon he would go back to bed. With the American epic series now well underway, Hoover turned back to the Magnum Opus, or as he sometimes called it, his Roosevelt book. At some point in the 1950s, General Bonner Fellers visited Hoover at Suite 31A. The elderly ex-president was scribbling furiously. "What are you doing, Mr. President?" the general asked. "I'm making my book on Roosevelt more pungent," Hoover replied. In fact, as early as 1954, he had begun to do just the opposite. In the final decade of his life, a slow but discernible change occurred in the texture of the Magnum Opus. Particularly after 1959, the manuscript became less accusatory and more understated in tone. Hoover's determination to call Roosevelt to judgment had by no means vanished. The book title that he finally settled upon, Freedom Betrayed, hinted at his judgmental intent. But his strategy, to a considerable degree, had shifted. Instead of driving his lessons home like a prosecutor to a jury, as he had done in his 1953 draft, he increasingly tried to guide his readers toward the correct conclusion, more unobtrusively, by the sheer, unstoppable weight of his evidence. Sometime in 1959 or 1960, Hoover concluded that his colossal manuscript must be condensed. This decision touched off still more rounds of laborious revision, even as his health began to fail. Pencil in hand, he persevered, writing draft after draft, or as he called them, edition after edition. Late in 1962, at the age of 88, he finally drew the line. After correcting edition number 10 of the Magnum Opus, he renamed it Edition Z, the last letter of the alphabet. But Hoover being Hoover, he didn't quite stop there. I found when editing these many boxes of manuscripts that after he finished edition Z, he proceeded to do some further revisions. He became known as Z plus H or Z plus HH, presumably for Hoover. He also informed his staff in 1962 that henceforth the Magnum Opus would consist of 3 volumes, not 2. For more than a year, he had been preparing a series of what he called tragic case histories of 4 nations, China, Germany, Poland, and Korea, that had fallen into chaos or communism in the years immediately after World War II. Initially, he'd intended to include these studies in Volume 2. He soon decided that they would constitute Volume 3 of this basically 3-volume in 1 volume, as it eventually turned out to be. Well into 1963, he endeavored to put all these components into final shape. And they have indeed been located, and these final components are Volume 3 of the 3-part book before us. As much as anything now, a sense of duty was driving Hoover on. A conviction that he especially, with his extraordinary life experiences and peerless collection of historical records, was equipped to lay before the American people the whole truth about what he called the betrayals of freedom in the past 30 years. He regarded his onerous task as a solemn calling, the one thing he wished to complete before his death. He told a friend in early 1963 that he hoped to leave behind his 3-volume opus as a sort of will and testament before I finally vanish. On September 26, 1963, Hoover informed a friend that my major job, the case history of the Second World War and its betrayal of freedom, is now completed except for my staff overhaul to check every sentence for its accuracy. As Hoover waited for his staff to complete its fact-checking, he could look with satisfaction on all the other products that his factory had turned out in the previous 5 years. Between 1959 and 1964, he published 7 books. It was an amazing feat. 7 books published between the ages of 85 and 90. But not yet the Magnum Opus, the one that mattered most. On October 20th, 1964, Hoover passed away in New York City. Under the terms of his will, ownership of his manuscript passed to a family foundation, which he had created in 1959. It would be up to the foundation to decide what to do next. In the end, the Hoover Foundation did not proceed to publication. Instead, the Magnum Opus was placed in storage, where it remained out of view for several decades. Since Hoover's sons and their key associates at the time are now deceased, one cannot say for certain what prompted them to put the Magnum Opus aside. Most likely, it boiled down to apprehension about the controversy that publication might generate, especially so soon after Hoover's dignified burial amidst public acclaim. It was a concern that Hoover himself had voiced on occasion when he had worried that what he called mud volcanoes on the political left would erupt against him when his book appeared. Whatever the concerns of that time, the passage of nearly half a century has removed them. In 2011, with the permission of the Hoover Family Foundation, Hoover's Magnum Opus was published, and the files pertaining to it, more than 200 archival boxes, are now open to scholarly research at the Hoover Institution in California and the Hoover Presidential Library in Iowa. Time heals all wounds, it is said, and as Edwin M. Stanton remarked in 1865 of Abraham Lincoln, Herbert Hoover now belongs to the ages. His published works are part of the patrimony of American civilization. They now include the Will and Testament to the American People, to which he gave the title, Freedom Betrayed. Let me close with a few brief observations. In its final form, Freedom Betrayed is part memoir and part diplomatic history, and it deserves our attention for two reasons. First, Hoover's opus is one of the best examples of a genre of scholarship and polemic that flourished for a decade and more after World War II. Revisionist, conservative historiography on American diplomacy during that war. Indeed, the Magnum Opus is probably the most ambitious and systematic work of World War II revisionism ever attempted, and its author, none other than a former president of the United States. On issue after issue, Hoover raised crucial questions that continue to be debated to this day. For example, did Neville Chamberlain err in his guarantee to Poland in March of 1939? A guarantee that he could not really effectively fulfill. Did Franklin Roosevelt deceitfully maneuver the United States into an undeclared and unconstitutional naval war with Germany in 1941 before Pearl Harbor? Did the United States government ignore or even willfully sabotage a chance for a modus vivendi with Japan in the autumn of 1941? Prince Konaway, who had attempted that, failed, and he fell from power. Tojo came to power in mid-October, and we know what came next a few weeks later. Did Roosevelt unnecessarily appease Joseph Stalin at the pivotal Tehran Conference in 1943? Was Tehran the occasion for a great betrayal of the Atlantic Charter and the ideals for which America fought? Did communist agents and sympathizers in the White House, Department of State, and Department of the Treasury play a malign role in some of America's wartime decisions? And Hoover has much to say about that too. And did a cabal of left-wing advisors who were hostile to Chiang Kai-shek steer President Truman's policy toward China in a direction that undermined Chiang Kai-shek and paved the way for the fall of China to the communists? On these and other controversies, Freedom Betrayed takes its stand. It is a document with which historians should be acquainted. I should perhaps add that when invited to bring this book to publication, I approached my task as an editor and not as an advocate or critic of Hoover's views. I sometimes think I might still be writing my introduction to the book if I had stopped to systematically evaluate each of his contentions. But that is the kind of book Freedom Betrayed is. bold and contrarian. It challenges us to confront anew some of the most vexatious issues of World War II statecraft. Second, Freedom Betrayed merits study because it provides a matchless window into the mind of one of the 20th century's preeminent leaders. For 2 decades, Hoover devoted phenomenal energy to preparing this tome. He considered it to be the most important of all his writings. From a biographical perspective, one cannot fully understand Hoover's post-presidential career of 31 and a half years without reading the Magnum Opus. Nearly 70 years ago, during World War II, Hoover began to scribble the first words of this work. He did so in the shadow of 3 great disappointments: his inability to win the Republican presidential nomination in 1940, his failed crusade to keep the United States out of World War II, and his frustrated bid to become the great humanitarian in Europe for a second time. Yet, like Winston Churchill in his wilderness years, Hoover fought back on the printed page and elsewhere. He never surrendered. In 1964, he was buried where he was born, in West Branch, Iowa, after a career extraordinarily rich in achievement and honors. Only one great accomplishment eluded him at the end: publication of Freedom Betrayed. But history, someone has said, is a conversation without end. Nearly 50 years after he completed work on his magnum opus, it seems fitting to welcome Mr. Hoover back to the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you indeed. We have opportunity for some questions, and there is a microphone which is going to be moving around. Our own Oprah Winfrey will hand it around, if you don't mind. And if you would, please wait for the microphone, because that will help us record your words for posterity, and you can publish them 50 years later.
Thank you for that wonderful talk. Your analysis of Hoover's analysis of Europe in 39 and 40 mentions Finland as a humanitarian problem. Could you talk about Finland and the Winter War more as a strategic problem for Franklin Roosevelt?
Yes, the Winter War, the war against Finland, I think, was really a result of the division of prospective spoils that Hitler and Stalin had made in August of 1939. Under that, Hitler obviously got Western Europe, and he got what he wanted, for a free hand to turn west, and also without having fear immediately, at least, of an attack on the Eastern Front. And secondly, Roosevelt, or rather Stalin, got claim to Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Eastern Poland, Bessarabia, and Bukovina. Also, he decided he was going to take back some of Finland. So that war broke out in December of 39. It's probably relevant to mention here that Hoover very quickly jumped into that situation by organizing something called the Finnish Relief Fund, which was enormously popular in the United States. Finland was the kid being beaten up by the bully. And the Finnish cause was extremely popular in the United States. It was a nonpartisan issue. And Hoover, because of his humanitarian reputation and expertise and contacts and so forth, raised a good deal of money in the United States for humanitarian assistance to Finland, I'm sorry. Now, the strategic problem, of course, Finland's a great distance from the United States. There was talk of a loan, I think, of $20 million to the Finns. But by the time that was working its way through Congress, the Finns basically had to surrender, give up. They were simply overwhelmed. This whole episode, among other things, helped to rehabilitate Hoover, because he was identified with the cause that had made him famous, that you might say it even made him president, the cause of humanitarian relief in the world, that he had done so successfully during and after World War I. And here he was trying to help the people of Finland through food relief and things like that. So it was helpful to Hoover. That was somewhat resented by Roosevelt, because Roosevelt suspected, and I think correctly, that Hoover was hoping to ride the wave of his new popularity and his refurbished image to the Republican presidential nomination. Hoover would, I think, have denied that, and I see no indication in Hoover's actions as relief director that he was doing that with the thought that he could somehow, manipulate that for political advantage. But I think he couldn't help but notice that he was getting accolades again, and he had already been confiding to friends in various ways that he was interested in running again and seeking vindication. So I hope that's something of an answer to your question. Obviously, the United States could not intervene effectively to help Finland, but there was an effort, and Hoover took some credit for the popularity of the effort in Congress to at least provide some money so that the Finns could provide military equipment and so forth. But by the time that was nearing fruition, it was too late.
I found a curious lack of context in Hoover's thinking in the approach to World War II and in the war itself, in that, at least in your reporting, he seemed to totally overlook what the Germans were doing. I'm talking of the Holocaust. I'm talking the 6 million Jews and the millions and millions of other people. How could Hoover have overlooked that? It was not mentioned in that. That's part of the context.
Okay, well,
this accounts in many ways for why Roosevelt felt as he did, Churchill felt as he did, and I don't understand how Hoover can have totally left that out. Could you please explain?
Okay, well, let me explain that I've written a very lengthy introductory essay in which it goes along with this book. It's 100 pages or longer, 150 pages or so, which goes into what I couldn't compactly put into a 50-minute lecture. But let me address the question. Hoover was anti-Nazi. He had gone and met Hitler and thought that Hitler had insane streaks when Hoover had a meeting which he didn't want, but the American ambassador had never met to Germany, had never met Hitler. So when the invitation came as Hoover was moving through Germany in March of '38, Hoover rather reluctantly went and had an hour or so with Adolf Hitler. And he wrote about it in it's a chapter in which he discusses his interpretation of Germany, and it was certainly not a pleasant or a satisfying one for a prospect for him to look on. He did early on, as many people thought, that the British Navy and the French Army would be a check on Hitler. And so it was astonishing to nearly everyone, including Stalin, incidentally, when the French collapsed so quickly in 1940. Hoover was very worried that Britain might fall, and he was in favor of aid to Britain. And a number of occasions he spoke out along these lines. But he did not want the United States to send troops to fight Britain. He did not think that after the summer of 1940, the British were really in danger of invasion. And he goes into this at great length in the book. And he's right that Hitler very early and after the summer of 1940 in the Battle of Britain decided to turn his legions to the east and go after Russia, which Hoover argued was Hitler's real intention all along. Now you have to, so he's quite aware, I think, of the Nazi regime's criminality. He was not aware at the time of the Holocaust. He was certainly aware of the persecution of the Jews. He mentions it before the war. He took a number of steps. He, in fact, was under consideration by the Roosevelt administration to head up a Jewish resettlement project in Africa, probably where Kenya is today, before World War II, that Jewish refugees from Europe could go there and resettle. And Hoover very much wanted to be the director of that. Well, it fell apart. It never quite came together, and then the war broke out, and that was the end, alas, of that effort. So Hoover, in a number of ways, showed sensitivity to the suffering, and he said in his writing about his trip to Germany, he went into Poland next, I think, and he said it was just such a relief to get out of that pressure. He just sensed the totalitarian atmosphere. But his fundamental point was that geopolitically, and I imagine it startles you, it startled me as I read it, his argument was that the true thrust of the Nazis was to the east. There they would confront another tyrannical regime of great brutality. It already killed millions of people in the purges and the famines of the 30s and so on. So he called them the two Satans. And he argued that the best thing to do was to have them clash and, in his view, weaken each other. Now, you might say, well, what if one of them won? I think he thought early on that the Germans would probably win, but it would not be a true victory, that they would never consolidate in the East, even if they knocked the Russians out in the fall of 41, even if the Russians left Moscow as they were preparing for a short time to do in October of 41. They were going to move to, I think the town was Kubyshev, 600 miles away, so there were indications that the Russians would have fought on and bogged the Germans down. And so Hoover said, that gets Britain off the hook. Hitler is going to be consumed by this Eastern quagmire where he can't possibly truly win the war in the East. And he argued at one point, he said, conquest always dies of indigestion. That was in that speech of his in June of 29th of 41, which he regarded as the most important of his life. So he thought that for all of the terrible nature of the Nazi regime, the best way to handle it and the other alternative terroristic regime, tyrannical regime, was to have them fight each other, which he argued, and which Chamberlain evidently agreed with, and some others, he argued was the natural course of events. He simply did not buy the argument that Hitler really, really wanted to go west. He thought that was not where Hitler's emotions and heart and evil vision lay. So that was his argument, and he was afraid that by propping up the Russians without extracting any quid pro quo, we would end up making the world safe for Stalin, so that at the end of the war we would get rid of one tyranny, and Hoover was happy with that, but we would have another one and a new kind of global confrontation. So I hope that supplies some additional context to the Hoover understanding. And I'm not here to defend that or say that that was the correct interpretation, but I think the value of the book in that regard, I would say, is that it does challenge us to think outside the box a little bit and think, what if we had behaved rather differently towards Stalin during that time of our wartime alliance? And so that is one area where I think Hoover does challenge us at least to rethink. We may not end up agreeing with him, but I think it's worth the process, worth the effort to look at that in that context. So I hope that has been somewhat helpful to you in explaining just Hoover's viewpoint. So I'll stop at that and perhaps turn to the next question.
So my question is the comparison between Winston Churchill's memoirs of the war and Hoover's memoirs of the war, because it seems like you could construct a course over comparing those two, having students read two magnum opuses, Churchill's and Hoover's. It seems that from your description, Hoover's indictment of FDR is similar to Winston Churchill's. But then what's very different is their attitude towards the war prior to the war. Right? So, I mean, afterwards it seems that Winston Churchill also doesn't approve of FDR's closeness to Stalin and willingness to acquiesce with Stalin's takeover of Eastern Europe. But their attitude at the beginning of the war is so different. Could you talk a little bit more about that? I mean, that for Churchill, the idea of Europe as a consortium of small nations, not dominated by either Germany or Russia, is essential to the idea of liberty. And he can't imagine, I mean, of course, Churchill is European, but he can't imagine preserving the ideal of liberty without preserving Europe as a consortium of small nations with limited territory, limited power. Whereas Hoover seems to think that you can preserve American liberty without Europa, without the idea of Europe still being in existence.
Okay, I'll make some effort to respond to that. Hoover, I alluded to it in my talk, but obviously it needs some amplification. Hoover believed, and I'll quote him here from a speech March 31st, 1938, right after his 7-week trip to Europe where he met many of the leaders at the time. He said, "Our national mission is to keep alight the lamp of true liberalism. Hoover believed in what we today call American exceptionalism. And he had argued that Europe and America had grown 300 years apart, as he put it on more than one occasion. And he argued that America's role in the world should be to raise that lamp of liberty to be an example, not an oppressor to, but an example for humankind. And he argued that if we deviated from that role, particularly by getting ourselves embroiled in a kind of world conflagration, that we would risk our economic liberty and perhaps even our political liberty, that we would have to fight fascism with fascist methods, as he put it. And I think by fascist methods, he wasn't thinking stormtroopers or, concentration camps. He was thinking of the kind of government control of the economy that he himself had helped administer as food administrator in World War I. And I think he found that experience somewhat a mixed one in terms of his recollection. So Hoover saw the American role of assistance to Europe to be primarily economic, spiritual, if you will, and providing a place of refuge. And he argued that even though there would be many unpleasant things happening in Europe, that would not last over time, and that the fratricidal war, as he put it, as I quoted him in my speech, between Hitler and Stalin was going to weaken both of them, and that would limit the damage there to the rest of the world. So he had a very different view of Hitler, not in a sense of difference on Hitler's badness, that is, with respect to Churchill, but he argued that a very different geopolitical vision, which had some popularity in certain parts of Great Britain. So Hoover probably was closer to Chamberlain, and his argument against Chamberlain, oddly enough, was that Chamberlain's mistake was to stop doing what he'd been doing. So what happened on March 15th, 1939 was Hitler took the rest of Czechoslovakia. Well, that made mockery of the Hitler statement, I think a few months earlier, that he had no more territorial ambitions in Europe after seizing the German-speaking Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia. Well, 6 months later, he's telling another story. That shocked the British. Hoover argues that the evidence shows that Franklin Roosevelt was really pushing Chamberlain to stand up to the Germans and to go all out for the Poles. And Hoover argued, as I've said, that was, making a promise that he couldn't keep with tragic consequences. And he was thereby inducing Hitler, who had his eyes on the east, to turn and go west for a time, and then you'd go back and turn east, which is what, of course, Hitler did a couple of years later. So while I think Churchill and Hoover could be said to share a belief in Hitler's badness, I think Churchill had a much harder sense or deeper sense of what he saw as the danger of Nazism establishing a tyranny that could last. That would be a distinction, I think. I can't quote Churchill entirely, but in one of his famous speeches, he talked about how perverted science, I think, under the Nazis could lead to a dark age that would last 1,000 years or something like that. Hoover did not think that the Nazis could accomplish that. They would obviously cause an awful lot of terrible things, but he did not think that the Nazi regime could survive the war experience, and they could never really digest all those conquests. So while there would be a long period when Europe would be a mighty unpleasant place to be, that in the long run, the soil of freedom would be refreshed. And as he used to say to the Czechs and others, that great nations will rise again. So Hoover took a rather different view of the long run. Now, as you know, once the war started in the East, Churchill immediately jumped into an alliance, which is, I think, perfectly understandable, because this immensely relieved the pressure on the British to have a second front. So Churchill went right into an alliance with Stalin. That's obviously a very different viewpoint. Hoover has two sections in the book. Actually, they're materials that he wrote didn't include in the Magnum Opus in the final version. I've included them in a long appendix, two little essays on Winston Churchill. And he's very critical of Churchill's statecraft, but very admiring of Churchill's leadership qualities. So there's an ambivalence there. And I don't want to go into too long an answer here on this, but Hoover and Churchill had clashed over Hoover's attempt to replicate in World War II what he had done in World War I, namely feed German-occupied Belgium and several other countries. And neither Roosevelt nor Churchill would allow Hoover to do that. And Hoover thought that Churchill was quite hard-heartedly permitting starvation of millions of people who were civilians in the German-occupied countries. And there was great fear, not only shared by Hoover, but by many experts at the time in 1940, that over the winter of 40-41, there would be mass starvation on just incalculable scale in the occupied countries. So Hoover saw himself as performing or trying to perform a humanitarian role. And Churchill said in a speech to Parliament August 20th, I think, 1940, basically, that there will be suffering, yes, but that's the price, I'm paraphrasing, that will have to be paid, because the real humanitarian thing will be their ultimate liberation. So Hoover and Churchill clashed, and Hoover, I think, was quite angry at Churchill, who he thought had a too narrowly militaristic vision. And of course, one could make different arguments against Hoover from another perspective. So they had certain things in common. They were almost exactly the same age, incidentally. They met once or twice while Hoover was president and Churchill visited the United States. Unfortunately, I cannot find any evidence of what they said to each other. I think I may one of these days try to write a little article comparing Hoover and Churchill and try to tease out these hints that you see on their relationship. But I hope that that has been of some help to you in trying to show some of the distinctions. Hoover thought that the United States really was separate from Europe, and that its role could be to come to the rescue once Europe had settled back from its own civil wars and fratricidal wars, as he put them.
Hoover chaired 2 commissions on streamlining American government. I presume they didn't heed his advice. But did he think that the expansion and centralization of American federal government was a betrayal of freedom of a magnitude in the domestic order comparable to the betrayal on the international and diplomatic level?
He was very worried about those tendencies. And I suppose this is an opportunity for me to mention the other volume, if I may. This book, Freedom Betrayed, is on foreign policy. The subtitle is Herbert Hoover's Secret History of the Second World War and Its Aftermath. While going through hitherto closed files 4 years ago on this volume, I discovered another Hoover manuscript, a companion volume to this on domestic politics in the same period. The man was phenomenally energetic. That book he called his Crusade book. The title he gave to the manuscript was The Crusade Years. He worked on it in the 40s into the mid-50s, and the basic thrust of the book is, well, 2 or 3-fold. He has a section on his family life, section on the Hoover commissions. He talks about them. And the main chunk of the book is called The Crusade Against Collectivism in American Life, where he recounts his battles against Roosevelt and what he really thought of Wilkie and Thomas Dewey and so forth. So it's a parallel volume, and if I may, I will announce to you that is to be published in about 7 weeks. That's called The Crusade Years, Herbert Hoover's Lost Memoir of the New Deal Era and its aftermath. I think that when the family put the Magnum Opus into storage, they didn't realize that there was another set of materials that went along with it. I didn't know it existed, unlike the Magnum Opus, which I and other historians knew to exist because Hoover had talked about it in his lifetime and left words on paper. But this second one, this companion volume, is really the final chunk of his memoirs. So in that volume, you will find him addressing these very issues. And I'll just say this, that you could pick up many pages of that forthcoming volume and put them into op-ed pieces or blog posts today. So he's very concerned about what he called the challenge to liberty from statism and too much government regulation of the economy, and that this would tend to stifle prosperity as well as weaken individual freedom. One could go on, but Hoover put a lot of those thoughts into paper as it happens. So as it happens, he has yet another volume that he's going to bring around, that will be brought to the world in a few weeks' time. So that will be further grist for the mill here.
George is too modest because he forgot to mention that it's already available for pre-order on Amazon. So, one last question.
A lot of, excuse me, a lot of Americans plus Patton were opposed to joining forces with the Russians.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you very well.
A lot of Americans, including Patton, our general, were opposed to supporting the Russians.
Yes.
And even Hitler's own generals advised him against attacking Russia. Napoleon, history's shown that it's always been a big mistake to have all these fronts going on. But it would have been a good thing if Hoover had written his book. Maybe it would have warded off all of these problems that Americans had with gaining together to try to, instead of letting them duke it out, we got involved. And we took on Russia and made it possible for them to get the best parts of Berlin, made it possible for them to get a sector of Berlin, to get of almost all these Eastern Bloc countries. And we have ourselves to blame for that. So it would have been, I guess my question is to you is, why didn't Hoover publish this book while Hitler was, chancellor? Why did he procrastinate?
Well, this volume, Freedom Betrayed, is really volume 5 of his 6-part memoirs. He systematically started writing them in the summer of 1940 before we entered the war. He did not get to this part, the part dealing with World War II, until 1944. And he really didn't complete a draft, I suppose, the first draft till about 1945 or 46, and then there's draft after draft after draft, as he kept revising it every little while. He just wouldn't leave it alone. So obviously Hitler was gone, the war was over before Hoover had completed his historical inquest. And then what happened? Well, he did other things. The 2 Hoover commissions took a lot of time and would exhaust most mortals, but Hoover managed to keep on going, even though he was getting into his 80s even. Also, more and more material came out. After the war, Cordell Hull and many others wrote their memoirs, and Hoover started searching, and he had this economist, Arthur Kemp, doing a lot of reading for him, making little book reports and pointing Hoover to the best passages and sources and so forth. So Hoover had this problem. He's perpetually running after more and more information. And I suspect some graduate students, if there are any in the audience, can understand this. You're writing what became for Hoover like a dissertation. Well, there's one more document I've got to find. And someone just released something in the State Department. So a little bit more comes and he starts revising and integrating and so on. And the book starts to get more and more footnoted toward the end as the polemical fury of it somewhat subsides and he decides, well, I'm just going to present all this evidence and people will make their inferences, which he, of course, carefully hopes will be his inferences. So I think that's one reason I wouldn't use the word procrastinate, except that he was a perfectionist and he wanted to have everything right. And he knew he was going against, the tide of public sentiment about the war. He said at the end, in one of the passages I included in the end, he's really unrepentant on this score. He says that I was opposed to the war. This is 1953 he's writing. I was opposed to the war and every step of policies in it. I have no apologies, no regrets. I had warned the American people time and again against becoming involved. I stated repeatedly its only end would be to promote communism over the earth, that we would impoverish the United States and the whole world. The situation of the world today is my vindication. Now that's Hoover at his most polemical in 1953. But then I think some of the people around him may have said, well, Chief, they called him the Chief, you've got to you got more information to incorporate. Maybe you should adopt a different style, or maybe he thought of that on his own. And he does start to tone down what he called some of his acid remarks about Winston Churchill, but I thought they were of sufficient historic importance that a couple of those passages or sections I decided to include in an appendix to help amplify the record here. So I think that helps to explain why Hoover kept holding off. And also, of course, Truman was alive. And Truman and Hoover had become friends. And Hoover, while Truman is not the focus of this book, there are critical passages on Truman, particularly with respect to the atomic bomb and the policy toward China, that Hoover was critical of. And he may have felt, oh, do I really want to jeopardize the friendship? And so he was pulled both ways toward the end. He wanted this will and testament to be published. But at the same time, he knew that there would be mud volcanoes and maybe it would hurt some people's feelings. Well, I think that as time went by, another generation of the Hoover family, I think, came to feel, one particular grandson who wanted this published, that the time had come to let history take this into account. One more thing on the Russians in World War II. I think it has to be said in Roosevelt's defense that early on in the war, for the first year or so, it looked like the Russians might not hold on until the Battle of Stalingrad. And then, even then, it wasn't certain that the Russians had the strength to push the Germans back. That took a little more doing, and it probably took a lot of help from us in the form of Lend-Lease that gave them enormous quantities of war material and food supplies. But the argument early on was, we need the Russians to win. We can't defeat the Germans on our own. So when Russia was weak, we were propping up Russia, no questions asked. And then when Russia got stronger to the war, the argument becomes, well, how can we stop them? The Red Army is occupying all this territory. Are we going to go to war against the Russians? Hoover's view, and I think a number of historians currently are coming to this view, that was that the United States should have insisted on more of a quid pro quo approach early on when Stalin was weak. And Stalin wouldn't even allow our military advisors to come in and look on the Eastern Front. He wanted the Lend-Lease, but he didn't want anybody around. Russians were very uncooperative with us in many ways, and there's not time to go into all of that. So Hoover argued, and some of the current historians in this field, I think I can properly say, are arguing that Roosevelt was altogether too trusting of Stalin and convinced of Roosevelt's own ability to charm Stalin into being a good bourgeois gentleman who would be a fellow policeman of the world after the war. And there's been a lot of criticism, not by Hooverites necessarily, but scholars currently, of what is seen as perhaps a failure on the American part to at least try to do more to check the advance of Stalin with his ambitions. There was a lot of naivete, a lot of propaganda about Uncle Joe and so on, the wartime ally who was taking most of the casualties and so forth, and one has to mention that. So I think that's one area probably where the Hoover viewpoint might resonate a little today, not necessarily the viewpoint that we could have hoped for an adequate outcome if the two dictators had fought each other. It's not clear where that would have turned. But if we had said to Stalin, look, we both got the common enemy, but we're not going to give you so much Lend-Lease unless you tell us specifically why you need what you're asking for. They just said, we want this, we want that. And Roosevelt's attitude was, and I'm not exaggerating, give it to him, be nice to him, and he'll be nice to me. And I'll just quote Roosevelt. He said that, and in 43, this is still in the middle of the war, Ambassador Bullitt said to him, Stalin's got plans for world domination. And this is Roosevelt's reply: I just have a hunch that Stalin is not that kind of man. Harry Hopkins says he's not, and that he doesn't want anything but security for his country. And I think if I give him everything I possibly can and ask nothing from him in return, noblesse oblige, he won't try to annex anything and will work for a world of democracy and peace. Now, you can argue how much choice did Roosevelt have in terms of alliances, strategy, and the facts on the ground of the Red Army advancing westward. But that, I think, is where Hoover would say, and others, that we at least should have been more guarded in the kind of alliance that we set up to defeat the evil of Nazism. because we permitted another monstrous regime to enter into Central Europe.
Thank you. Well, I have to say, I had no idea that Hoover was going to turn out to be such a hero of mine, as someone who is, every time I sit down to make my book shorter, it becomes longer. I now have someone to look up to. So, speaking of long books, though, George has been gracious enough to sign copies of the Hoover tome out in the front lobby, so you can pick up one there and have it signed there. If you would please join me in thanking Professor Nash.